Marcus Garvey once said, "A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." Well, the Williams family has one branch of our tree that is of particular interest during this time of the year, our Pilgrim ancestors. This movie traces our history back to those brave individuals who gave up everything they knew in order to pursue their faith without persecution. We begin the journey back in time with Nellie Woods. Born in Illinois on April 7, 1882, she married Edward Williams in 1908 and traveled with him to Washington, moved back to Illinois, and eventually settled in California. Nellie's mother was Laura Bell Dixon. She was born on February 7, 1860 in Indiana. She married Edward Woods in 1880. She and her family traveled along with Nellie's to Washington, Illinois, and California. Laura's mother was Harriet Newell Kemp. She was born on January 11, 1816 in Jericho, Vermont. She traveled with her family to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and finally settled in Shelbina, Missouri. She met and married John Dixon in McCain Township, Ohio in 1835. John Dixon was an immigrant from Ireland who arrived on the Carolina Ann in New York on August 7, 1826. He left from Belfast, Ireland, with about 4.5 million other immigrants fleeing during the Great Potato Famine. Harriet's mother was Philena Chipman. She was born on January 7, 1792 in Essex, Vermont. She married Parker Kemp in Essex in 1812. There are several reasons why the Kemp family may have moved west, but it was likely that the introduction of merino sheep into Vermont favored large-scale farms and forced many small farmers to head out of the state. Philena's father was Joseph Chipman. He was born on August 5, 1761 in Essex, Vermont. He married Amy Reed in 1789 and was admitted as a freeman in Jericho, Vermont in 1798. He eventually settled in Ohio, most likely traveling with the Kemps as they went west. Joseph passed away in 1826. He was the father of 10 children. Joseph's father was Jonathan Chipman. He was the 7th son born on October 24, 1729 in Groton, Connecticut. He married Catherine Reed in 1756 and lived in Salisbury, Connecticut. He served in the Connecticut militia in 1775. In 1774, he became one of the earliest settlers of Middlebury, Vermont, clearing a 100-acre lot next to his brother Thomas. He moved in 1790 to Essex, Vermont. He died in 1819, the father of 10 children. Jonathan's father was Thomas Chipman. He was the oldest son born in Barnstable, Massachusetts on November 17, 1687. He married Abigail Lathrop in Stonington, Connecticut in 1711. In September 1714, he moved to Groton, where he was a tavern keeper. In 1741, he moved to Salisbury and was the owner of a saw and grist mill. He was one of the founders of the Salisbury Congregational Church in 1744. He was also a justice of the peace and the first associate judge of the Litchfield County Court. He died in 1752, the father of 10 children. Thomas's father was Samuel Chipman. He was born on April 15, 1661 in Barnstable, Massachusetts. In 1686, he married Sarah Cobb. He was a carpenter, but farming was his principal business. He built the Chipman Tavern on his father's homestead near the Custom House. Religious services and court sessions were often held in taverns in colonial times. He became a member of the church in 1691 and was ordained a deacon in 1706. He was a man of good business habits, often employed as a town officer. He died in 1723, the father of 11 children. Samuel's father was John Chipman. He was born in Bryanspittle, England around 1614. In May 1639, John came to New England in the service of his cousin, Mr. Richard Derby, who settled in Plymouth. In 1646, he married Hope Howland. In 1649, they moved to Barnstable. He was for successive years a selectman, then a magistrate, and was often a deputy to court. In 1659, John and his 3 assistants were designated to frequent the early Quaker meetings and endeavor to show them the errors of their ways. He became a member of the Barnstable Church in 1653 and was ordained a ruling elder in 1670. He died April 7, 1708. John's wife, Hope Howland, was born in Plymouth on September 13, 1646. She was the 3rd child of her parents. Children generally remained in the direct care of their mothers until the age of about 8 years old, after which time it was not uncommon for the child to be placed in the foster care of another family. Some children were placed into households to learn a trade, others to be taught to read and write. Most children experienced a religious conversion around the age of 8 as well, thus becoming church members. Hope married John Chipman in 1646 and moved with him to Barnstable. On August 7, 1650, she joined the Barnstable Church. She eventually had 11 children, all but one surviving to adulthood. She died on August 30, 1629. Hope's parents were Elizabeth Tilley and John Howland, who both came over on the Mayflower. Elizabeth Tilley was born August 30, 1607 in Henlow, England. Elizabeth's parents were John Tilley and Joan Hurst. In the late 16th century, some Englishmen believed more reforms were needed to purify the church. Among the more radical of these Puritans were the Separatists, who formed congregations entirely apart from the English church. The English crown forbade separation from the church, persecuting and imprisoning many. In 1609, roughly 100 Separatists fled to Leiden, Holland, which was made famous for its large textile industry and its religious tolerance. Their life there was principally one of long, hard labor, much of it at the looms, where they wove various fabrics. After a decade in Leiden, the low wages, the danger of renewed war with Spain, and the concern for their children's future led them to seek another solution. The Leiden separatist community decided to relocate to America. Among them were Elizabeth, her parents, her aunt, and uncle. John Howland was born around 1591 in Fenstaten, England. His parents were Henry Howland and Margaret Ayres. At the age of 28, he was employed by John Carver, a Puritan minister who joined with William Bradford in bringing his congregation from Leiden to the New World. Howland, while formerly a servant, was in fact Carver's assistant in managing the migration. The Leiden separatists bought a small ship, the Speedwell, in Holland. They embarked from Delfshaven on July 22, 1620. They sailed to Southampton, England, to meet the Mayflower, which had been chartered by their English investors. There, other separatists and additional colonists joined them. The Mayflower and the Speedwell both left Southampton. However, leaks in the smaller ship forced the pair to stop in Dartmouth for repairs. The 2 ships proceeded to sea, but were soon forced to return to Plymouth, where the Speedwell was eventually sold. Some of her passengers crowded aboard the Mayflower, while others stayed in England to await passage the next year. Finally, on September 16, 1620, the Mayflower set sail, alone, for America. The Mayflower was a sizable cargo ship, around 100 feet in length. She had served many years in the wine trade. With the crowding of 102 passengers plus crew, each family was allotted very little space. During most of the voyage, the families were confined to the gun deck, a space of about 58 by 24 feet, or half of a basketball court. Within that space, families built themselves little cabins for privacy. They lived in these spaces for the 66-day voyage, and then many lived there for another 4 to 6 months as they explored the coast for a place to live. The first half of the voyage went smoothly, with the only issue being that of seasickness. That changed in October, when Atlantic storms became severe. Several times the wind was so strong that they had to just drift where the ocean took them, as it was not safe to use the sails. It was during this turbulent time that John Howland was thrown overboard, but managed to grab a topsail line that was trailing in the water and was hauled back aboard safely. The Mayflower anchored at Provincetown Harbor on November 11, 1620. The Pilgrims did not have a patent to settle here, so they had no legal authority to establish a colony. So while still aboard the ship as it lay offshore, they drafted and ratified the first governing document of the colony, the Mayflower Compact. This social contract was written and signed by John Tilley and John Howland, along with 39 other separatists. It made clear that the colony should be governed by just and equal laws, and those who signed it promised to abide by that contract. Their first task was to rebuild the shallop, a shallow draft boat that had been built in England and disassembled for transport aboard the Mayflower. On November 15th, Captain Miles Standish led a party of 16 men, including John Howland, on an exploratory mission. The shallop was finished on November 27th, and using it, a second expedition was undertaken. 34 men went, including John Tilley and John Howland, but the expedition was plagued by bad weather. A third expedition, including John Howland and John Tilley, left on December 6th. The number of people was less than half of the prior expedition due to many becoming sick as the English faced freezing weather wearing unsuitable clothing. Unfortunately, this excursion resulted in a skirmish with the local Native Americans known as the First Encounter near modern-day Easton, Massachusetts. Failing to secure a site for their settlement and fearing that they had angered the local Native Americans, the Mayflower left Provincetown Harbor and set sail for Plymouth Harbor. The Mayflower dropped anchor in Plymouth Harbor on December 16th, and the settlers spent 3 days looking for a settlement site. They chose the site of a recently abandoned Native American settlement named Patuxet. The location was chosen largely for its defensive position, but also because the prior native villagers had cleared much of the land, making farming relatively easy. On December 21st, 1620, the first landing party arrived at the site. Their plan to begin building houses was delayed by inclement weather until December 23rd. The first order of business was to lay down the main street which ran from the top of the hill to the beach. All plots of land, one each given to a family, were on the street. Simple one-room houses were to be built for each family, and each dwelling included a garden plot. The first house built was the common house and took 2 weeks to complete in the harsh New England winter. The men sawed planks from trees and the boys made wooden pegs. The floor was packed dirt. The roof was thatch, dried grass tied into bundles. Its purpose was for storage, but soon became a hospital. The work stopped on Sundays for all-day church services. As the building progressed, 20 men always remained ashore for security purposes, while the rest of the work crew returned each night to the ship. Women, children, and the sick remained on board the Mayflower. Many had not left the ship for 6 months. During the winter, the colonists suffered greatly from diseases like scurvy and pneumonia, as well as the cold, wet conditions on board ship. Many of the able-bodied men were too ill to work, so only 7 residences and 4 common houses were constructed during that first winter. By the end of January, enough of the settlement had been built to begin unloading provisions from the Mayflower. In mid-February, after several tense encounters with the local Native Americans, the male residents of the settlement organized themselves into military orders. By the end of the month, 5 cannons had been defensively positioned on Fort Hill. In March 1621, a warm and early spring arrived. However, only 4 of 18 women survived from the passengers and half of the married men. 19 of 29 unmarried men were still alive. 4 entire families had died. Most of the children had lived, all 7 girls and 10 of the 13 boys. The colonists evidently had given the best food and clothes to them. Included in the dead were Elizabeth Tilley's parents, aunt, and uncle. The 14-year-old orphan was taken in by the Carver family. On March 16, 1621, the first formal contact with the Native Americans occurred. A Native American named Samoset walked boldly into the midst of the settlement and proclaimed, "Welcome, Englishmen." Samoset returned to Plymouth on March 22nd with a delegation from Massasoit that included Squanto, an Indian who had spent time in Europe and spoke English quite well. After an exchange of gifts, a formal treaty of peace was negotiated. This treaty ensured that each group would not bring harm to the other and that they would come to each other's aid in a time of war. On April 5, 1621, after being anchored for almost 4 months in Plymouth Harbor, the Mayflower set back for England. By the fall, only 53 pilgrims were alive to celebrate a harvest feast. That event consisted of a full day of prayer and worship and probably very little revelry. On November 1621, 1 year after the pilgrims first set foot in New England, a second ship sent by the merchant adventurers arrived. Named the Fortune, it arrived with 37 new settlers for Plymouth, and without many supplies, putting a strain on the resources of the colony. In 1623, John Howland and Elizabeth Tilley were married when Elizabeth was not quite 16 years of age and John was 31. Their daughter Desire was born on October 13, 1623. The first Thanksgiving, as the Pilgrims would have called it, probably did not occur until July 1623, in response to the good news of the imminent arrival of additional colonists and supplies. The celebration would have included wild turkeys, duck, venison, eels, and lobster. Indian corn porridge, local vegetables, and berries would have completed the meal. In July 1623, 2 more ships arrived carrying 96 new settlers. In March 1624, a ship bearing additional settlers arrived, including John's brothers Arthur and Henry Howland. In 1625, John joined Edward Winslow in exploring the Kennebec River in Maine, looking for possible trading sites and resources that the colony could export. The next year, a group of colonists assumed the debt owed to the merchant adventurers of London, who had backed the Pilgrims financially. In 1627, Governor Bradford placed John Howland in charge, and a brisk trade developed in Plymouth with the Indians. Elizabeth gave birth to John Jr. on February 24, 1627. In 1628, Howland was elevated to the post of assistant governor of the Plymouth colony. John moved to Cushnick, Maine in 1629 to manage the trading station there. For approximately 7 years, John Howland was in charge of the outpost. During that time, Elizabeth gave birth to 3 more children: Hope, our ancestor, in 1629, Elizabeth in 1630, and Lydia in 1633. The trading station in Cushnick was very successful. The Pilgrims traded corn and manufactured goods with the Indians for beaver, otter, and other furs. The proceeds of this trade enabled the colony to settle their remaining debts with the merchant adventurers. John Howland was admitted as a freeman of Plymouth in 1633. In 1637, John received 40 acres of land, and in 1639, he was given a choice of additional land for himself or his heirs around Yarmouth and Dartmouth. John and Elizabeth became major landholders in Plymouth and the surrounding towns. In 1639, John purchased land and a house in Rocky Nook, where he spent the rest of his life. 5 more children were born to Elizabeth and John. For nearly 40 years, John Howland was actively involved in the governance of Plymouth through elected or appointed positions. He was a surveyor of highways, on the committee for fur trading, one of the Plymouth assessors, one of the 5 selectmen of Plymouth, one of the 4 Plymouth deputies to the general court, and one of the 7 Plymouth assistant governors for the colony. In 1672, John Howland died in the Plymouth house of his son Jabez. Unfortunately, in 1675, the Rocky Nook farmhouse burned to the ground, so Elizabeth moved in with Jabez until he sold the Plymouth house in 1680. Elizabeth then moved to Swansea to live with her daughter Lydia Brown. In 1687, Elizabeth Tilley Howland died and was buried in the Brown family plot. The Jabez Howland house was owned as a private residence until 1915. The house was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1974. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "Death comes to all, but great achievements build a monument which shall endure until the sun grows cold." It is reported that currently there are over 10 million living descendants of the 51 Mayflower Pilgrims who had children. What greater legacy for those brave souls who crossed the ocean than to have their lineage so strongly represented in a country where freedom lives and dreams for a better future endure.